So good evening, everyone. My name is Samir Sinha, and I'm a geriatrician. I'm a doctor that specializes in the care of older adults. And I'm speaking today from Toronto, or also known as the Dish with One Spoon territory. So why is a geriatrician here? Well, I represent, or I want to represent, many of our older Canadians. And people would say, well, what's the matter with them? Because, right, they're pretty much covered with medication plans. That the lucky thing is that if you are 65 and older, there's probably a provincial plan that gives you near universal coverage. So what's the challenge, and why should they be thinking about a Pharmacare conversation? Because as Dr. Morgan and my colleagues have already talked about, is that we have a patchwork system that doesn't even serve older Canadians very well. Now, right now, 18% of Canadians are 65 and better, as I like to say. And by 2031, when our baby boomers start turning 85, 1 in 4 Canadians will be 65 and older. But we also know that nearly all older Canadians are living at least with one or more chronic conditions, and therefore happen to be taking at least one or more medications. We also know that when it starts coming to medication use, we know that right now, 25% of older Canadians who are 65 and better may be taking 10 or more prescriptions. And so when they're taking these prescriptions, that's great because it says that there's a lot of access being given to older Canadians. But the challenge that we have is that with access also comes the challenge of making sure that people are being appropriately prescribed the medications that they're on. And one challenge we have is that while most older Canadians have access to a number of medications, not necessarily universal access to all the medications they need, we know that 50% of older Canadians are actually being prescribed one or more inappropriate medications, and 18% are being prescribed two or more inappropriate medications. And so this is the challenge, that not only do we need to think about how do we better provide universal access to all populations, including older adults, but how do we also make sure that the medications that they're being provided are appropriate? And why? Well, my colleague, Linda Silas, was just speaking about, as a frontline nurse and as for me as a physician, we often see the challenges when people are not being appropriately prescribed their medications. Because we know that right now, 60% of the adverse drug events that we actually see happening in Canada each and every year are happening amongst older adults, who actually represent 60% of the medications that are being provided through public drug programs. But we also know that 40% of these adverse drug events, which could include hospitalizations and potential permanent disability and death, are often preventable. So this is the challenge that we have, is that when we think about the importance of providing universal coverage and universal pharmacare, we want to make sure that we are improving access, that we want to make sure that all Canadians have access to the appropriate medications, including medications for our older people. But we also want to make sure that there are no barriers to access, because even for older Canadians right now, we know that even a small copayment of $2, $3, $4 often can create enough of a barrier where people who need to be taking medications aren't even taking those medications. So this notion that there's universal coverage and therefore universal access isn't really true. And we know that copayments can be problematic. So we need to think about, how do we not create problems of access for our older Canadians? Again, we need to also think about the appropriateness of the prescribing that we're doing. So we want to make sure that the medications that we are prescribing are appropriate when they're being prescribed, but also we want to make sure that there are processes through which we can actually make sure that we're regularly reviewing a person's medications, maybe annually on their birthday, to make sure are any medications still necessary, or any medications unnecessary, so that we can actually make sure that they're on the right mix of medications they need. And making sure that we enshrine the processes of appropriate prescribing and even deprescribing, as I like to call it, to all of our prescribers, whether they be nurse prescribers, whether they be pharmacist prescribers, or whether they be physician prescribers as well. And so by thinking about this appropriateness aspect, and by thinking about improving access and affordability, this is how we can think about a sustainable pharmacare system that, as Dr. Morgan talked about, if we actually implement this, we can actually create a much more sustainable and universal model of care that can better support all Canadians as we age. So I'll finish there, and thank you very much. Merci.